There are cases, my dear reader, that one recalls with the faint amusement of an old soldier reminiscing about battles won and lost, curious incidents of forgery, deception, or theft that, though fascinating, bear no weight upon the course of history. But there are others, rare and perilous, that must be sealed away, their details known only to those who stood upon the precipice of disaster and, by some extraordinary stroke of providence, managed to pull the world back from the brink. The affair of the Queen's final secret is one such case. It is only now, long after the principal figures have faded from public memory, that I am permitted to set down this singular episode in my chronicles of Sherlock Holmes. Even as I write, I find myself transported to that night, the thick London fog swirling against the panes of 221B Baker Street, the golden flicker of lamplight casting long shadows upon the walls, and Holmes himself, ever the inscrutable figure, hunched in his chair with fingers steepled, his keen gaze lost in contemplation of some unseen mystery. This case did not begin, as so many of ours did, with an announcement in the Times, nor with the arrival of an agitated housemaid or a trembling widow. No, this matter was of a different nature altogether. It was a secret whispered through the corridors of power, passed between the lips of men who governed an empire, and carried to our modest lodgings by one who trembled beneath the weight of knowledge, too dangerous to bear alone. And yet, as I would soon discover, there was only one mind in all of England capable of untangling its dark and tangled web. The evening had passed in an uncharacteristic silence. Holmes, who was often inclined to monologues on criminal psychology or the peculiarities of tobacco ash, had spoken little since the post had arrived some hours prior. Instead, he sat in his chair by the fire, his long fingers interlaced, his eyes half-lidded as though in deep meditation. I had learned by this stage of our acquaintance that such moments were not to be interrupted. When Holmes was engaged in thought, he required no disturbance, no careless remark to break the intricate workings of his mind. And so, I occupied myself with a volume of medical journals, though my gaze strayed more often than not to my friend. It was a peculiarly heavy envelope that had commanded his attention, a thick cream-coloured missive bearing an unfamiliar seal. He had examined it in silence, turning it over with the precision of a jeweller inspecting a rare diamond, before breaking the wax and reading its contents in a manner that betrayed neither surprise nor amusement. And yet, I sensed at once that something in the letter had stirred him, for he had not spoken since. It was only when the clock on the mantel struck 10 that he finally stirred, exhaling a long, deliberate breath. "We shall have a visitor before the hour is out, Watson," he murmured, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "And unless I am much mistaken, his errand shall prove to be of singular interest to us both." Holmes's prediction was, as always, infallible. Scarcely had he spoken than the bell at the front door sounded, its echo vibrating through the stillness of our lodgings. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson's firm yet polite voice could be heard, followed by the heavy footfalls of a man ascending our stairs. When the door swung open, I beheld a gentleman of evident distinction, though his current state suggested a man whose composure had been shattered. He was tall and well-built, clad in an immaculately tailored coat of dark navy, his gloved hands clenching the rim of his hat so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His features were sharp, his temples dusted with grey, and his expression one of barely concealed distress. His gaze darted about the room before settling on Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice taut, I do not know where else to turn." Holmes, whose gaze had not wavered since the man entered, inclined his head. "Then you have come to the right place," he said. "Pray, be seated, Sir Reginald Ashcombe." I started at the name, for it was not unfamiliar to me. Sir Reginald Ashcombe was known in political circles as one of the Queen's most trusted courtiers, a man of unwavering loyalty to the Crown. That he should come here, alone and visibly shaken, suggested that whatever matter had driven him from Windsor Castle on such a night was not one of mere diplomacy. "You are in distress," Holmes observed, "and I suspect that the matter you bring is one of considerable urgency. Speak freely, sir. You have my undivided attention." Ashcombe took a slow, steadying breath before uttering words that would set into motion one of the most perilous cases of Holmes's career. "A document has vanished, Mr. Holmes. A sealed decree, written by the Queen's own hand, containing a secret that, if revealed, could change the course of British history." Sir Reginald Ashcombe shifted uneasily in his chair, his fingers tightening over the brim of his hat. For a long moment, he hesitated, as though weighing the prudence of his next words. At last, with a sharp exhalation, he leaned forward and spoke in a hushed tone. "A document has disappeared, Mr. Holmes, a most private and classified decree, penned by Her Majesty's own hand and sealed within her personal writing desk at Windsor Castle." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "And the nature of this decree?" Ashcombe's gaze flickered toward the door before settling back upon Holmes with an expression of grave reluctance. "I cannot say." Holmes made a soft sound of amusement. "You mean that you will not say, Sir Reginald? That is an altogether different matter." I observed a flicker of irritation cross our visitor's features, though he controlled it well. "Understand, Mr. Holmes, that this decree was not meant to be seen by any eyes but those of the Queen and her most trusted advisers. Its contents, if made public, could cause an upheaval the likes of which this nation has never seen." Holmes steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. "And yet someone has seen it, or at the very least taken great pains to ensure that no one else does." Ashcombe nodded grimly. "The desk was found intact, its lock unbroken. No sign of forced entry, no misplaced papers. Only the decree itself had vanished. Whoever took it was no ordinary thief. This was the work of someone with access, intelligence, and a most dangerous intent." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "A locked room mystery indeed. Now, Sir Reginald, tell me, who has had access to the Queen's chambers within the last 24 hours? Ashcombe hesitated once more. His discomfort was evident, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, that this matter extends beyond mere theft. This document, it was not meant to be known, even by those within the highest circles of government." Holmes remained impassive. "And yet someone deemed it necessary to remove it." Ashcombe exhaled sharply. "There are forces at play, Mr. Holmes, that even I dare not name. Men of influence, of power, individuals who would see this decree destroyed before it could ever reach the light of day." I could not suppress a shiver at his words. It was rare to see a man of Ashcombe's standing so visibly shaken, and rarer still for Holmes to be confronted with a case in which even the identity of the opposition remained obscure. Holmes regarded our visitor with an expression of cool detachment. "You have come to me, Sir Reginald, because you know that I concern myself with facts, not politics. If this document is as dangerous as you imply, then its disappearance is only the beginning of something far graver. I must insist that you tell me, who, aside from yourself and Her Majesty, knew of its existence?" Ashcombe pressed his lips together, then, with great reluctance, murmured a single name. "Lady Eleanor Marchmont." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed lightly together. His eyes had taken on that singular sharpness I had come to recognize as a sign that his mind was working at an extraordinary speed. "A fascinating puzzle, Watson," he murmured at last. "A document of immense consequence, vanished from a locked room without a trace. A courtier who fears even to speak of its contents, and a name given with the hesitance of a man who knows it will invite danger." He rose suddenly, pacing toward the window. "Lady Eleanor Marchmont," he repeated, "a most curious choice of confidant." He turned sharply to Ashcombe. "What more can you tell me of her?" Ashcombe hesitated. "She was loyal to Her Majesty, devoted to the crown." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet, Sir Reginald, I find that those most devoted are often the ones who know the greatest number of secrets." It was barely dawn when we found ourselves in a closed carriage bound for Windsor Castle, the steady clatter of hooves on cobblestone our only company. The summons had come swiftly and under strict secrecy, forbidding even a whisper of our destination beyond the walls of 221B Baker Street. Holmes, seated opposite me, was uncharacteristically silent, his long fingers drumming lightly against his knee as he stared through the misted window. "I trust you understand the gravity of this case, Watson," he said at last. "For Sir Reginald Ashcombe to involve me directly, the matter must be perilous indeed." I nodded. "And for the Queen to allow us access to her private chambers, with the strict condition that she is not to be disturbed," Holmes finished. "A most intriguing stipulation, is it not?" Upon our arrival, we were escorted by Sir Reginald himself through the silent corridors of the castle. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, and more than once I noticed the guards exchange uneasy glances. Finally, we reached a pair of heavy oak doors, beyond which lay the Queen's private study. "You may proceed," Ashcombe murmured. "But be swift. If your presence here is discovered—" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "You forget, Sir Reginald, that discretion is among my lesser virtues." Without another word, he pushed open the doors and stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the room with the keen scrutiny of a hawk. I followed close behind, and in that moment, the true magnitude of our task became painfully clear. The crime had left no trace, and therein lay its most troubling peculiarity. Holmes crossed the chamber in 3 swift strides, his gaze moving with an intensity that only I could recognize. He paused before the Queen's writing desk, a fine mahogany piece, elegantly carved, its surface utterly undisturbed. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "No forced entry, no shattered lock, and yet the document has vanished." I stepped forward, running my fingers along the smooth brass handle. "Perhaps a key—" Holmes cut me off with a shake of his head. "The Queen's desk has but one key, which has remained in her possession. Unless Her Majesty herself is responsible for this theft, we must assume that another method was employed." He gestured to the floor, which bore no signs of disturbance. No mud, no scuff marks, no trace of hurried retreat. Whoever did this was either spectral in nature or exceedingly careful. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the case settle upon me. "Then how, Holmes? If the lock was untouched and the room left undisturbed, how could the document simply disappear?" Holmes tilted his head, his lips curving slightly. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely the question we must answer." With that, he withdrew his magnifying glass and began a careful inspection of the desk's surface, his expression one of mounting interest. Within moments, his sharp eyes landed on something that made him pause. He glanced at me with an almost imperceptible flicker of satisfaction. "The thief was indeed careful," he murmured, "but not careful enough." Holmes leaned in, his fingers ghosting over the desk's polished surface before pausing over an object I had, until now, entirely overlooked. A single sheet of parchment resting beneath a silver letter opener. The edges were immaculate, save for a small but unmistakable smudge upon the wax seal. "A rushed hand," Holmes remarked. "Someone disturbed this document in great haste, likely brushing against it as they made away with the Queen's decree." He held it up to the light. "Note the fine dust along the edges, a near invisible residue of sealing wax. The stolen decree must have been placed atop this one before its removal, leaving behind this subtle but telling mark." He turned away and strode towards the Queen's armchair, inhaling deeply. A slight frown creased his brow. "Jasmine," he murmured, faint but unmistakable. I followed his gaze but saw nothing of interest. "You believe the thief wore perfume?" Holmes shook his head. "Not perfume, Watson. Gloves. This scent is not one applied for vanity's sake. It lingers upon fine leather, suggesting that our culprit took great pains to leave no fingerprints." He pivoted suddenly, directing my attention to the ornate clock upon the mantelpiece. "Tell me, Watson, what time do you see?" I glanced at the face. 9:15. Holmes smiled thinly. "And yet, when we entered, Sir Reginald informed us it was precisely 9:22. I started. "It is running slow." Holmes nodded. "By exactly 7 minutes, and that, my dear Watson, is no accident." I stared at him, confounded. "You mean the thief deliberately altered the time?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed. And now, my dear friend, we must determine why." Holmes had just finished noting the peculiar state of the Queen's desk when the door opened and a woman stepped inside. She was tall and elegant, though the rigid set of her shoulders betrayed tension. Her gloved hands remained clasped before her, and her eyes, dark and sharp, flickered briefly toward Holmes before settling on Sir Reginald. "This is Lady Eleanor Marchmont," Ashcombe said, clearing his throat. "She has served Her Majesty faithfully for many years." Holmes observed her in silence for a moment before speaking. "A pleasure, Lady Eleanor. You are troubled." The lady's lips pressed into a thin line. "I do not know what you mean, Mr. Holmes." "You avert your gaze," he said lightly. "A natural instinct when one wishes to conceal something." Her jaw tightened. "I have nothing to conceal." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Then allow me to ask, were you the last to see the Queen's decree before its disappearance?" A pause. A hesitation almost imperceptible, yet not to Holmes. I do not know what you mean." Holmes leaned forward. "On the contrary, Lady Eleanor, I believe you know precisely what I mean, and I believe that your reluctance is not due to ignorance, but to fear." Lady Eleanor took a step back, her breath unsteady. "I cannot help you, Mr. Holmes," she whispered. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and left. Holmes watched her go, his eyes narrowing. "Watson," he murmured, "there is more to Lady Eleanor's silence than mere loyalty." Before Holmes could speak further, the door swung open again, and a man in the uniform of royal security strode inside. His gait was firm, his bearing that of a man accustomed to authority. "Inspector Harrington," Ashcombe introduced him. "He is in charge of the Queen's personal security and has been overseeing the investigation." Holmes offered the inspector a curt nod. "Then you are aware of the peculiar circumstances surrounding this theft?" Harrington scoffed. "Peculiar?" "No, Mr. Holmes. It is rather straightforward. The document was stolen by foreign agents, spies no doubt, who managed to slip past our defences." Holmes arched a brow. "With no signs of forced entry? No footprints? No disturbance of any kind?" Harrington's lips curled slightly. "Not all criminals are clumsy brutes, Mr. Holmes. You assume too much." Holmes studied him for a moment before replying, "And you assume too little, Inspector." Harrington's expression darkened. "I do not need the interference of amateurs in this case." Holmes merely smiled. "An amateur I may be, but I assure you, Inspector, I am an observant one." Harrington scoffed again. "If you wish to chase phantoms, do so at your leisure. But I assure you, Mr. Holmes, this is a matter for men of experience, not theorists with magnifying glasses." With that, the inspector turned sharply on his heel and left the room. Holmes exhaled. A man of experience, Watson, but alas, not a man of insight. It was a young palace guard who provided the next piece of the puzzle. He had been summoned at Holmes's request and stood before us now, his hands rigid at his sides. "You were on duty last night?" Holmes inquired. "Yes, sir," the guard replied. "And did you see anything out of the ordinary?" The man hesitated. "Well, sir, there was something." Holmes gestured for him to continue. "Around midnight I was making my rounds near the east corridor when I saw movement. A figure cloaked and hooded, just beyond the Queen's study." "Did you apprehend them?" I asked. The guard shifted uncomfortably. I tried, sir, but when I called out, they disappeared into the shadows. It was like they weren't even there." Holmes's eyes gleamed. And did you notice anything else? A sound? A scent? The guard frowned. Now that you mention it, there was a scent. Something faint. Floral, I think. Jasmine? Holmes asked, his voice quiet. The guard's eyes widened. Yes, sir. That's it exactly. Holmes leaned back. Thank you. That will be all. As the guard departed, I turned to my friend. A cloaked figure, moving unseen and carrying the scent of jasmine. What do you make of it, Holmes? He smiled. I make of it, Watson, that our thief was here long before the crime was committed, and that they left behind far more than they intended. Holmes turned away from the Queen's desk, his eyes scanning the chamber with renewed intensity. There is something here, Watson, he murmured. Something small, something easily overlooked, but something vital. I watched as he moved methodically through the study, his hands brushing lightly over objects, his keen gaze missing nothing. Then, at the far end of the room, near the mantel, he paused. Watson, he said, his voice laced with satisfaction. Bring me the candle holder. Puzzled, I retrieved the ornate brass holder from the mantelpiece and handed it to him. Holmes turned it over in his hands, then, with a flick of his fingers, loosened the wax at its base. A small slip of parchment fluttered to the floor. Ashcombe gasped. What is that? Holmes bent to retrieve it, holding it up to the light. The edges were scorched, as if it had been briefly exposed to flame. The writing upon it, though faint, was still legible. I leaned in, my breath catching as I read the inscription. A.M. Ashcombe paled. Good heavens! Holmes studied the letters for a long moment before folding the parchment carefully. We have our first true lead, Watson, and I suspect that A.M. is far more than a simple set of initials. Holmes remained still for several moments, his sharp gaze fixed upon the slip of parchment bearing the initials A.M. He turned it between his fingers, as though by mere touch he might extract from it the secrets it concealed. Then, with a quiet hum of satisfaction, he laid it upon the Queen's desk and turned to Sir Reginald Ashcombe. Tell me, Sir Reginald, he said, have you ever heard the name Countess Amalia von Metzingen? The blood drained from Ashcombe's face. Von Metzingen? He repeated in a whisper. Surely not. She has not been seen at court in years. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. And yet, the initials on this parchment would suggest that her influence remains very much alive. I leaned forward in surprise. But who is this woman, Holmes? The name is unfamiliar to me. Holmes's steely gaze did not waver from Ashcombe. Perhaps Sir Reginald would be better suited to answer that question. Ashcombe swallowed hard, his fingers tightening against the edge of the desk. Countess von Metzingen was once a confidant of Prince Albert, he admitted at last. A woman of considerable charm and intelligence, but also of dangerous ambition. She was of German nobility, though she spent many years in England, wielding an influence far beyond what was deemed appropriate for a foreign-born lady. The Queen herself trusted her implicitly, until rumours began to circulate that she had been passing certain sensitive information beyond our borders. Holmes nodded. And when the Prince Consort died, she disappeared from court, did she not? Yes, Ashcombe murmured. Banished in all but name. Holmes tapped a finger against the desk. A woman with access to the highest echelons of power, a woman scorned, and a woman whose name appears in connection with a stolen decree that could alter the very fabric of the monarchy. Do you not find that exceedingly interesting, Watson? I could not deny it. The idea that a figure long thought exiled from court could now, from the shadows, hold in her grasp a secret powerful enough to shake the empire was a chilling one. Holmes straightened. It is time, I think, that we paid a visit to an old acquaintance of the Crown. We had scarcely left the Queen's study before I turned to Holmes in earnest. Do you truly believe this is the work of Countess von Metzingen? After all these years, Would she still have the means to orchestrate such a theft? Holmes cast me a sidelong glance. It is not a question of means, Watson. It is a question of motive, and I believe the Countess has ample reason to wish this decree buried forever. I frowned. But why? If she has been away from England for so long, what possible gain could she derive from stealing a document of such importance? Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. You assume, as so many do, that crime is always rooted in material gain. That is a fallacy, my dear fellow. Wealth is a paltry ambition when set beside the allure of power. But what kind of power? Holmes steepled his fingers. Consider this, Watson. If the Queen's decree is what I suspect it to be, then it is not merely a legal document. It is a weapon. A weapon against those who hold sway over the monarchy, those who stand to lose should its contents ever be made public. I began to understand. Then this is not about foreign spies at all? Holmes's eyes gleamed. No, Watson, this is not the work of opportunistic thieves or enemy agents. This is a game of shadows, played by those who seek to control the fate of a nation. We had scarcely left the Queen's study when we were intercepted by a young footman, his breath coming in hurried gasps. His face, pale as parchment, betrayed a terror he could barely contain. "Sir Reginald," he stammered, It's Lady Eleanor Marchmont. She is dead." Ashcombe staggered back, his hand gripping the wall for support. "Dead," he echoed, his voice scarcely above a whisper. Holmes, however, remained composed. "How?" he asked curtly. "The physician believes it was poison, sir," the footman replied, his voice trembling. "She was found in her chambers not half an hour ago, cold as stone, her tea untouched but for a single sip." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Without another word, we turned on our heels and followed the footman through the labyrinthine corridors of Windsor Castle. Lady Eleanor's chamber was dimly lit by the dying embers of a fire. The air was thick with an acrid medicinal scent, and near the window a maid sobbed into her apron. In the centre of the room lay Lady Eleanor Marchmont, her form draped across a chaise, her eyes closed as if in uneasy sleep. Holmes approached the body and bent low, his fingers grazing the delicate porcelain teacup that rested upon a nearby tray. A single sip had been taken, leaving the faintest imprint of her lips upon the rim. His gaze flickered toward a half-finished letter upon the escritoire, the ink still fresh, as if she had been interrupted mid-thought. He straightened and turned to Ashcombe. "What time was she last seen alive?" "Around 9 o'clock, Ashcombe answered hoarsely. "She retired early. There was no sign of distress." Holmes's fingers tightened around the handle of his magnifying glass. "No distress, perhaps. But there was fear, Sir Reginald. And fear, I believe, is what killed her as surely as the poison in this cup." Holmes moved about the chamber with swift precision, his eyes flickering over each object, each shadow, as if they might whisper their secrets to him. He paused by the bedside table, where a delicate silver pendant lay overturned. "Watson," he murmured, motioning for me to examine it. I lifted the pendant carefully. It was an elegant locket, its clasp broken, as if it had been torn from her neck. Inside was a single lock of pale hair, pressed between two panes of glass. There was no portrait, no inscription, only that solitary strand, carefully preserved. Holmes regarded it for a long moment before tucking it into his pocket. "A keepsake, no doubt," he murmured. "But of what significance?" He turned back to the body, his gaze drawn once more to the cup upon the tray. "The tea, Watson. Would you agree that she barely had time to taste it before death took her?" I nodded. "A fast-acting poison, then? Or a mind too consumed by terror to fight against it?" Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "There was no forced entry, no struggle. Lady Eleanor sat here alone in her chamber and took a single sip before death claimed her. I ask you, Watson, Why would a woman in fear for her life take tea from her own hand? I hesitated. She must have trusted the one who brought it. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. And that, my dear friend, is the most chilling detail of all. He turned to Ashcombe. Lady Eleanor knew something. She feared speaking it, and now she has been silenced. We are dealing with a foe who does not hesitate, who kills swiftly and without remorse. And that means, Sir Reginald, Holmes's eyes darkened, that the true danger still lurks within these very walls. Holmes's examination of Lady Eleanor's chamber was conducted with his usual silent intensity. He moved through the room with the precision of a surgeon, each glance, each movement revealing some fresh detail that had escaped the notice of others. "The tea, Watson," he murmured, lifting the delicate porcelain cup with his fingertips. A single sip taken before she succumbed. And yet, notice the colour. Slightly darker than it should be, is it not? I leaned in and frowned. "You suspect poison?" "Suspect? No, I am certain of it." He turned the cup slightly, allowing the liquid to catch the dim light. A subtle bitterness to the scent. This was not an ordinary toxin, but something expertly administered, likely odourless and tasteless, save for the faintest trace left behind. He placed the cup down with care and gestured toward the chaise. "And here, Watson, note the manner in which she fell. Her limbs are not thrown outward in convulsion, but rather slumped as if in a faint. The poison acted swiftly, but she had time enough to realize what was happening before the end." I felt a chill at his words. Then she knew her fate. Beyond doubt. And yet, she made no effort to call for aid. Why? I had no answer, but Holmes had already turned his attention to a second peculiarity, a nearby chair that had been overturned. He righted it and ran his hand over the armrest. "A struggle of sorts," he mused. "Yet there are no marks upon her body, no sign of force. What then caused her to recoil?" His fingers drifted over the cushion before he suddenly turned toward the bedside table. The locket we had discovered earlier lay open where I had left it. Holmes lifted it once more, his sharp gaze flickering between the empty clasp and the broken chain. "A missing pendant, Watson, and I believe this is no mere ornament. It is a key." "A key to what?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "That, my dear friend, is what we must discover." Before we could delve further into Lady Eleanor's secrets, the door burst open and Inspector Harrington entered, his expression one of triumph. "It is done," he declared. "We have our culprit." Holmes did not even turn. "Fascinating," he murmured. "And who, pray, have you settled upon?" Harrington's chest swelled with authority. "A French diplomat, Comte Arnaud de Rochefort. He was seen loitering near the Queen's quarters last night, and there have long been whispers of his involvement in foreign interests." Holmes finally turned, his face unreadable. "And what evidence do you possess against him, beyond mere circumstance?" Harrington bristled. "He was found attempting to leave Windsor in the early hours. What more do you require?" Holmes exhaled. "Much more, Inspector." He gestured toward the scene before us. "Does this seem the work of an opportunistic agent? A diplomat attempting espionage would act with discretion, not poison a woman in the heart of the palace, and linger about like a common thief." Harrington's face darkened. "You question my judgment." "I question the convenience of your conclusion," Holmes replied coolly. "Lady Eleanor was murdered because she knew something. The Queen's decree was stolen by someone who feared its revelation. Tell me, Inspector, do you believe our unfortunate Comte had both the knowledge and the motive to commit such an act?" Harrington hesitated. "He is French," he said at last. Holmes sighed. "Ah, well then, the matter is settled. Come, Watson, let us inform Her Majesty that her enemies need not be clever, merely Gallic." I stifled a chuckle, but Harrington's expression turned livid. "If you have a better suspect, Mr. Holmes, I should like to hear it." Holmes smiled thinly. "Oh, I have several, Inspector. but I do not accuse men until I am certain. The palace was in turmoil. Guards moved hurriedly through the corridors, whispers of conspiracy and treason spreading like wildfire. Yet, in the midst of it all, Holmes stood unmoved, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon some distant thought. "You are troubled," I remarked. "On the contrary, Watson," he murmured. "I am most intrigued." I glanced toward the doorway, where Sir Reginald Ashcombe was engaged in tense conversation with another court official. "Do you believe the Comte will be convicted?" Holmes let out a soft chuckle. "I believe he will be blamed, which is a very different thing. But no, Watson, the true villain is still at large, and they have already struck once. They will not hesitate to strike again." A weight settled in my chest. "Then there is more to come." Holmes finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "This is not the work of an amateur, nor even of a single individual. We are dealing with a carefully orchestrated design, executed by someone who understands power, fear, and silence." I shuddered. "Then what is our next course of action?" Holmes's gaze darkened. "We wait, Watson. The real game is just beginning." Holmes remained silent for the better part of an hour following our exchange with Inspector Harrington, his gaze fixed upon some unseen point beyond the flickering candlelight of our chamber. He had taken his pipe in hand, but had not yet set it to his lips. A sign, I knew, that his mind was occupied with intricate deliberation. At last, he turned to Ashcombe. "Sir Reginald, if I were to tell you that the stolen decree has been recovered and now lies secured within a safe in the palace library, what would you say?" Ashcombe blinked. "I would say, Mr. Holmes, that I have heard no such thing." "Precisely," Holmes said, a gleam of satisfaction in his eye. "And yet, by midnight, it shall be the whispered certainty of every ear within these halls," I started. "You mean to spread false information?" "Not false, Watson," he corrected. "Merely premature. Consider, our adversary has gone to great lengths to retrieve this document. If they believe it is once more within reach, will they not make another attempt to claim it?" Ashcombe inhaled sharply. "You intend to draw them out?" "Precisely. We shall construct a fiction so tempting, so undeniable, that our quarry will have no choice but to act. They will believe that the decree lies locked within the impenetrable safe of the palace library, watched by men too complacent to expect a second intrusion. And when they come to take it—" Holmes's lips curled into a shadow of a smile. "We shall be waiting." Ashcombe hesitated. "But if they suspect deception—" "They will not," Holmes said smoothly. "For I have observed that those who seek power often assume themselves the cleverest in the room. Our adversary will act, Sir Reginald. The only question is how swiftly." With that, Holmes rose and signalled for a footman. "Send word discreetly through the castle that the missing document has been recovered and secured within the palace library. Let the walls themselves carry the tale." I exhaled, glancing at Holmes. "And now—" Holmes reached for his coat. "Now, Watson, we prepare for a visitor." By midnight, Holmes's trap had been laid. The rumour had spread with remarkable efficiency, whispered from servant to footman, guard to official, until even those who had no business knowing of the decree's disappearance spoke of its retrieval in hushed tones. The library had become, for all intents and purposes, the vault in which the fate of the empire was now said to rest. Holmes, Watson, and a select few trusted guards took up their positions in the shadows of the grand chamber, concealed within the alcoves and behind towering shelves of ancient volumes. The only source of light was the steady glow of a single oil lamp atop the great oak desk, where the supposed safe lay in plain view. Holmes had chosen his vantage point carefully, positioning himself where he could survey the entire room while remaining unseen. I, too, crouched in silence, my pulse quickening with each passing moment. Minutes crawled by, and the silence grew oppressive. Then at last came the sound we had been waiting for, the faintest shift of air, the nearly imperceptible creak of the library door easing open. A figure slipped inside, moving with the careful precision of one well-versed in evasion. Cloaked in darkness, the intruder paused, listening. Satisfied that they were alone, they advanced towards the desk. From my concealed position, I could make out little beyond a shadow moving with quiet urgency. Holmes had been correct. The bait had been taken. The figure reached the desk, their gloved hands hovering over the safe's lock. Holmes remained motionless, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap. Then, with a voice as smooth as silk, he spoke from the darkness. "The game," he said, "is over." Holmes's words struck the darkness like a blade. The intruder froze, their hands still poised over the safe's lock. For the briefest moment, there was utter silence. Then, with a sudden, desperate motion, the figure spun on their heel and lunged toward the shadows. "Not a step further, Sir Reginald," Holmes said coolly. "The doors are barred, the windows watched. There will be no escape tonight." A low curse broke from the figure's lips. Slowly, almost reluctantly, they straightened. The dim glow of the oil lamp cast just enough light to illuminate the unmistakable features of Sir Reginald Ashcombe. I felt an involuntary gasp rise to my throat. Good heavens! Ashcombe's face was taut with fury. His normally composed manner had shattered, and in its place was a man stripped of all pretenses. "You!" he hissed at Holmes. "You tricked me!" Holmes stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. "Did I?" he mused. "Or were you simply too eager to reclaim what you thought lost?" Ashcombe's breath came quickly. "You have nothing. No proof," Holmes exhaled, almost wearily. "Come now, Sir Reginald. A man of your intelligence should know better than that." Ashcombe's eyes darted wildly to the exits, as if measuring his chances. But the guards Holmes had stationed remained firm, their presence an unyielding wall. Holmes took another step closer. "You have played your part well, I admit. The loyal courtier, the Queen's most trusted servant. But you overreached, Sir Reginald. You thought yourself untouchable. You thought no one would question the death of Lady Eleanor, or the arrest of a foreign diplomat. But you made one fatal mistake." Ashcombe swallowed. "And what was that?" Holmes's lips curled. "You underestimated me." There was no more fight left in him. His shoulders sagged, and I saw in his eyes the realization of his defeat. He was caught. Holmes glanced at me. "Watson, I believe the time has come for Sir Reginald to explain himself." Holmes allowed the silence to stretch between them, as if granting Ashcombe one final moment to consider the depth of his predicament. Then, with deliberate slowness, he spoke. "The Queen's decree," he said. "You stole it. You murdered Lady Eleanor Marchmont to ensure her silence, and when the walls began to close in, you sought to frame an innocent man to divert suspicion. Is that not so?" Ashcombe clenched his fists. "You know nothing." Holmes tilted his head. "Don't I?" His voice was soft, almost amused. "Then shall I recount it for you?" He turned to me. "Watson, recall the evidence, the smudged wax seal, the scent of jasmine, the clock running precisely 7 minutes slow. Each of these tells a story, does it not?" I nodded. "Yes. The seal showed the decree had been disturbed in haste. The jasmine was the scent of the gloves you deduced Ashcombe wore. And the clock—" "Ah," Holmes interrupted, turning back to Ashcombe. "The clock. Tell me, Sir Reginald, did you think no one would notice? That pausing time itself would shield you from scrutiny?" Ashcombe said nothing. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. Holmes sighed. "Your intention was simple. By stopping the clock for 7 minutes, you provided yourself with an alibi. When it resumed, it would suggest the theft took place later than it did, conveniently absolving you of any involvement." He shook his head. "But time, Sir Reginald, has a way of revealing the truth." A sound broke the stillness, the rustle of movement as Inspector Harrington stepped forward. Enough, he said coldly. Sir Reginald Ashcombe, you are under arrest for the murder of Lady Eleanor Marchmont and the theft of a document belonging to the Crown. Ashcombe's face twisted with fury, but he said nothing. He knew, as we all did, that the game was over. Holmes turned to me as the guards led him away. Well, Watson, he murmured, a most illuminating evening, wouldn't you say? Holmes remained still as Inspector Harrington took Ashcombe into custody. Yet I knew that his mind had not ceased its relentless pursuit of truth. There was one final piece of the puzzle left to reveal. Sir Reginald, Holmes said at last, his voice measured, you have gone to extraordinary lengths, murder, deceit, and treason, and all for a single document. Why? Ashcombe sneered. You claim to know everything, Holmes. Why don't you tell me? Holmes's sharp gaze did not waver. Because I should like to hear you say it. Ashcombe laughed bitterly. Very well. The decree contained Her Majesty's intent to abolish certain hereditary privileges. If it had been enacted, the old noble families, mine among them, would have seen their influence wane, their stranglehold over Parliament loosened. Do you understand now? It was not simply a piece of parchment. It was the death warrant of the aristocracy. A hush fell over the chamber. Even Harrington looked momentarily stunned. Holmes nodded, as though confirming a theory. And so you stole it. And when Lady Eleanor, bound by conscience, would not be silenced, you ensured she was. Ashcombe's jaw clenched, but he did not deny it. I exhaled slowly. Good heavens, Holmes, if that decree had been made public. Holmes glanced at me. Then the course of Britain's future might well have changed. He turned back to Ashcombe. But you did not seek to preserve the nation, Sir Reginald. You sought only to preserve yourself. Ashcombe said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Holmes took a step closer. The theft was only the beginning, was it not? Ashcombe's silence was answer enough. You poisoned Lady Eleanor because she knew the truth, Holmes continued. You framed a French diplomat because you needed a convenient scapegoat. And when all else failed, you attempted to recover the document yourself, ensuring it was destroyed forever. Was that your grand design? For a moment, I thought Ashcombe would resist. But then, with a slow exhale, he lowered his head. You would never understand, Holmes. Men like you, intellect over instinct, you play at solving puzzles while the rest of us fight to keep the world from crumbling. Holmes studied him for a long moment. The world changes, Sir Reginald, he said quietly. You merely fought to keep yourself above the tide. A silence fell. The weight of Ashcombe's confession had settled upon us all. The moment stretched between them. Then, in a flash of motion, Ashcombe lunged. With surprising agility, he twisted free from Harrington's grip and made for the door. There was a glint of steel, a dagger drawn from his sleeve. For the briefest instant, I thought he might reach the corridor beyond, but he did not. Harrington, his reflexes swift, stepped into Ashcombe's path and struck him hard across the jaw. Ashcombe crumpled, the dagger clattering to the floor. Not so fast, the inspector muttered. I should think you have a great deal to answer for. Holmes regarded the fallen man impassively. And thus the game is over, he murmured. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Holmes, I said at last, have you ever known a case with such far-reaching consequences? Holmes regarded me with a faint smile. Perhaps, Watson. But history is a fickle thing. It is not the first time a kingdom has been threatened by ink and parchment, and it will not be the last. And with that, he turned. The matter closed. As Ashcombe was led away in iron restraints, I turned to Holmes with a sense of awe mingled with disbelief. The sheer scale of the deception, the cunning with which Ashcombe had executed his scheme, was nearly unfathomable. And yet, Holmes had seen through it all. I must admit, Holmes, I said, This case has left me in no small amount of wonder. How could you have been certain of Ashcombe's guilt? Holmes gave a small smile and gestured toward the Queen's desk, where our investigation had first begun. Consider, Watson, the clues we uncovered. A document stolen without a single sign of forced entry. A woman silenced before she could speak the truth. A clock deliberately set back to mislead us. Each, on its own, was but a fragment of a larger puzzle, but together they told a most compelling story. I frowned. Yet we had so little to go on at first. Had Ashcombe not fallen into your trap, would we have had enough to convict him? Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. There was never a single damning piece of evidence, Watson. Rather, it was a web of subtle details, ones which, when connected, could point to no other conclusion. He steepled his fingers. First, the theft itself. The Queen's decree could not have been stolen by an outsider, for there was no sign of forced entry. That meant it had to be someone within the palace. Who, then, had both the access and the motive? Sir Reginald, I murmured. Precisely. Then there was Lady Eleanor. Her death was no coincidence. It was a necessity. She knew too much, and Ashcombe could not afford to let her speak. The poison was not intended to be discreet. It was meant to silence. I exhaled. And yet, you knew before then, didn't you? You suspected him from the moment we arrived. Holmes gave a slight nod. His performance was too well rehearsed, Watson. A man may feign concern, but he cannot feign the absence of genuine surprise, and Sir Reginald, despite all his careful posturing, never once asked the most natural question of all. I frowned. Which was? Holmes's eyes gleamed. He never once asked why the decree had been stolen, because of course he already knew. I reflected upon Holmes's words and found myself recalling another detail, one that, at the time, had seemed trivial. Holmes, I said suddenly, the jasmine scent. You remarked upon it in the Queen's chambers. What role did it play? Holmes's smile deepened. Ah, Watson, you begin to think like a detective. The scent was perhaps the most damning clue of all. I shook my head. I failed to see how. A lingering fragrance, surely that alone could not have condemned Ashcombe. Not alone, Holmes agreed, but as a supporting piece of evidence, it was invaluable. You see, I recognized the scent at once, not as perfume, but as something far more distinctive. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small slip of parchment, the one we had found hidden in the candle holder. This note bore the initials A.M. Component placement leading us to Countess von Metzingen. It was a deliberate misdirection, an attempt to throw us off the scent, if you will. He allowed himself a brief chuckle at his own jest, but the real scent, the jasmine, came from Sir Reginald himself. I stared at him. From Ashcombe? Indeed, he wore gloves infused with jasmine oil, a rare luxury used to preserve the suppleness of fine leather. A detail he must have considered insignificant, but one which betrayed his presence in the Queen's study on the night of the theft. No one else in the palace used such a scent. Once I traced it back to him, there was no doubt left in my mind. I let out a slow breath. So in the end, it was not grand gestures that undid him. It was the smallest details. Holmes nodded. And therein lies the essence of all great mysteries, my dear Watson. Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of parchment. It was not the stolen decree, but rather the document we had discovered upon the Queen's desk, one that had, until now, seemed of little significance. Watson, he said, holding it up to the candlelight, what do you observe here? I leaned in, my gaze falling upon the lower edge of the paper, where a wax seal had been pressed. The mark was uneven, the impression blurred. A smudged seal, I remarked. It was pressed hastily. Holmes nodded. Precisely, and therein lies the folly of our culprit. I frowned. But what does it signify? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Consider, my dear fellow, how one seals a document. The wax is melted, the paper carefully pressed. A precise hand ensures a clean impression, yet here we find an anomaly, a document completely unrelated to the Queen's decree, yet bearing the unmistakable signs of interference. I exhaled. Then the stolen decree must have been placed upon it, perhaps in the thief's haste. Holmes smiled. Just so. The thief had but moments to conceal his crime. He lifted the decree in such a hurry that it left behind a faint residue of wax upon the paper beneath it, a detail so small that only one with an eye for the minute could detect it. I shook my head in wonder. And yet it was enough to betray him. Holmes tucked the parchment away. A crime, Watson, is rarely undone by grand miscalculations. More often than not, it is the smallest misstep that unravels the greatest of schemes. Holmes turned his attention to the fireplace mantel, where the ornate clock stood, its brass hands now ticking steadily. He gestured towards it with an air of quiet satisfaction. The final deception, Watson, lay not in what was taken, but in what was altered. I furrowed my brow. You mean the clock? Indeed. You recall that when we arrived, Sir Reginald claimed that the theft had occurred at precisely 9:22, and yet this clock, one of the most reliable in Windsor Castle, was running exactly 7 minutes slow. I nodded. A mere accident, perhaps. Holmes's smile was knowing. Or a calculated manipulation. Consider, Watson, if one wished to fabricate an alibi, what better way than to alter time itself? Understanding dawned upon me. Then Ashcombe must have stopped the clock momentarily, ensuring that when it resumed, it would provide him with a false window of innocence. Precisely, Holmes affirmed. It was a clever trick, but flawed in its execution. The Queen's household is governed by routine, servants, guards, officials, all moving in patterns as precise as the ticking of this very timepiece. When I inquired of the palace footman, I learned that the evening's events did not align with Ashcombe's claims. The discrepancy in time was small, but in cases of deception, Watson, even a minute's difference can shatter a lie. I let out a breath. So in the end, Ashcombe was defeated by his own cleverness. Holmes smiled faintly. Quite so. And as I have often remarked, Watson, there is nothing more dangerous than a man who believes himself too intelligent to be caught. As the final pieces of the mystery settled into place, I found myself once again in awe of Holmes's singular brilliance. It was not merely his ability to see what others could not, nor his command of logic and deduction. It was the ease with which he wove together the most delicate threads of seemingly unconnected events. A smudged wax seal, a faint scent of jasmine, a clock running 7 minutes slow. Each of these, in isolation, was nothing, a curiosity at best. And yet, in Holmes's hands, they became irrefutable proof, a chain of evidence so precise that even Sir Reginald Ashcombe had been powerless to deny it. Holmes, I said at last, as we stood in the Queen's study, the weight of the case now behind us, I confess, I do not know how you manage it. What seemed to me a tangle of coincidences, you unravelled with nothing but observation and reason. Holmes, who had been carefully refilling his pipe, gave a slight shrug. My dear Watson, the world is full of such details. It is merely a matter of knowing where to look. Even so, I insisted. It was a case of extraordinary complexity. The political implications alone. Ah, Holmes interrupted, striking a match and watching the flame dance for a moment before setting it to his pipe. It is not the complexity of a case that interests me, Watson. It is the simplicity hidden beneath it. Strip away the grand conspiracies, the veils of deception, and what remains? A man, desperate to preserve his position, making a series of miscalculations. A human error repeated throughout history. I shook my head with a smile. And yet, I doubt history will remember it as plainly as you do, Holmes. Holmes exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. History remembers what it is allowed to remember, Watson. Later that evening, as the final reports were delivered to the highest echelons of the palace, Word came that Her Majesty had made her decision regarding the decree. Sir Reginald Ashcombe's treachery had been laid bare, yet the document that had driven him to such extremes would not see the light of day. Not yet. Queen Victoria, ever the shrewd ruler, had chosen to suppress the decree for the time being. There are forces in this country, Sir Henry Ponsonby, her private secretary, informed us, that would see such a revelation as a call to arms. The Queen understands that progress must come, but it must come at its own pace, lest the kingdom be thrown into turmoil. Holmes nodded, though I detected a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. A wise decision, he murmured. I, however, could not help but feel a pang of unease. Then Sir Reginald achieved what he set out to do, I said quietly. The decree remains buried. Holmes glanced at me. For now, Watson. I frowned. Do you not think it should be made public? Holmes's gaze drifted toward the fire. Some truths, my dear fellow, are too powerful to be wielded recklessly. A revelation at the wrong moment can do more harm than the lie that preceded it. I fell silent, pondering his words. As we departed Windsor Castle, the cool night air wrapped around us, carrying with it the quiet hum of a world that had no inkling of the crisis it had narrowly escaped. Holmes strode ahead, his pace unhurried, his mind no doubt already turning to the next puzzle that might present itself. I could not let the matter rest. Holmes, I said as we walked, do you truly believe that such secrets should remain hidden? Holmes did not answer at once. He withdrew his pipe, striking a fresh match, his face briefly illuminated in the golden glow before the flame flickered out. That, Watson, he said at last, is the question upon which nations rise and fall. He took a slow draw of his pipe, exhaling a curl of smoke. Some secrets, my dear Watson, are not meant to be buried. They are merely waiting for their time. We walked on in silence, the distant chimes of Big Ben marking the hour as the shadows of Windsor faded behind us. And though the case of the Queen's final secret had been solved, I could not shake the feeling that its true consequences had only just begun. Holmes and I walked in thoughtful silence as the distant bells of Westminster tolled the late hour. The case had reached its conclusion, yet my mind lingered on the implications of what we had uncovered. You seem troubled, Watson, Holmes observed, tapping the embers from his pipe. I cannot help but wonder, I admitted. Sir Reginald's treachery is laid bare, yet the decree remains hidden. If such truths can be suppressed so easily, what other secrets might shape the world without our knowledge? Holmes gave a faint smile, his gaze fixed on the flickering gaslights. The world is not governed by truth alone, Watson. It is shaped by those who decide when the truth should be spoken. I shook my head. And yet, I wonder, what was Ashcombe's greatest mistake? Was it the crime itself, or his belief that he could outwit you? Holmes exhaled a thin curl of smoke. A curious question, my dear fellow. Perhaps one best left to the minds of our audience. What do you think was Sir Reginald Ashcombe's greatest mistake? Was it the smudged wax seal, the clock he tried to manipulate? Or was it something far deeper, his arrogance in believing he could deceive Holmes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed unravelling this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes cases. And if you know a fellow detective who would appreciate a tale of deception and deduction, share this story with them. The game is never truly over. It is only waiting to begin again.